The day Elias Carter lost his family's land, the entire town learned something brutal about power. 7 days is all it takes to erase generations of sacrifice when money decides patience is optional. 1 week. That was the deadline a massive regional bank gave a quiet farmer whose hands were permanently stained with dirt and hard work, a man who believed loyalty still meant something because his family had banked there for over 40 years. But while Elias stood helpless watching legal notices appear faster than rain clouds over dying crops, nobody paid attention to the one person silently watching everything unfold, his son, Mason Carter. And trust me, this part genuinely blew my mind, because while everyone assumed Mason disappeared to escape the shame, he was quietly building something nobody saw coming. What started as humiliation, betrayal, and greed would spiral into one of the coldest comeback stories imaginable, because years later, the same bank that destroyed Elias would suddenly belong to his son. Chapter 2 begins with something almost painfully ordinary, and honestly, that's what makes the entire situation hit harder. Elias Carter wasn't reckless, lazy, or irresponsible. He was the kind of farmer people pointed to when they talked about discipline. Every morning started before sunrise, every season came with sacrifices, and every dollar had a destination long before it entered his pocket. His family farm stretched across land his grandfather once worked by hand, and even though farming had become harder with rising costs, strange weather shifts, and shrinking profits, Elias kept pushing because people like him don't just quit. That's exactly how people act in real life, right? They endure. They convince themselves next season will fix everything. Next harvest. Next deal. Next opportunity. And for years, Elias survived that way, barely. Then came the season that changed everything. One brutal drought wrecked nearly half his expected production while equipment failures stacked up at the worst possible time. Repairs cost money he didn't have, suppliers stopped extending favors, and suddenly the local bank, the same institution whose managers used to shake his hand at charity events and call him family, started sounding strangely corporate. Payments that had once come with understanding suddenly came with warnings. Flexibility disappeared. Compassion became paperwork. At first, the bank framed everything politely. Letters arrived with phrases like temporary concern, review of lending conditions, and updated financial obligations. But underneath all that polished language sat something colder, pressure. Elias requested extensions. He showed records proving prior seasons had recovered losses. He explained the drought, fuel costs, machinery breakdowns, and regional farming instability. But none of it seemed to matter anymore. 3 new executives had recently taken control after expansion plans turned aggressive, and profit suddenly mattered more than relationships. Bro, hearing stories like this honestly frustrates me because it feels painfully realistic. The people who spend decades building trust are somehow the easiest to discard when spreadsheets stop looking pretty. And Elias? He still believed reason would win. That loyalty counted for something. He truly thought somebody inside that building would look at his history and realize forcing foreclosure over temporary hardship made 0 sense. Then the deadline arrived like a punch to the chest. 7 days. Not 60. Not 90. 7. A formal legal notice informed Elias that unless outstanding balances were corrected immediately, foreclosure proceedings would begin on the family property. The speed of it shocked everyone. Farmers nearby whispered about it at supply stores. Even locals who rarely cared about anyone else's problems quietly admitted something felt wrong. 7 days to save land tied to generations. That felt less like business and more like punishment. Elias stopped sleeping. He skipped meals. Stress carved itself into his face so deeply neighbors barely recognized him. He tried selling machinery, asking relatives for temporary help, negotiating payment plans, anything, but panic spread faster than solutions. Meanwhile, the bank representatives acted disturbingly detached, reducing decades of sweat and family memories into percentages and overdue balances. And then there was Mason Carter, Elias's son, who at that point seemed like the least likely person to matter in this story. Quiet, sharp, distant in a way people misunderstood, Mason had left town years earlier after endless arguments with his father about ambition. Elias believed in roots. Mason believed in scale. He hated watching his father struggle year after year for shrinking margins while corporations quietly swallowed independent farms. Four people assumed Mason abandoned the family dream to chase money in the city, and to be fair, maybe that's what it looked like. During the foreclosure chaos, he barely spoke publicly, didn't make dramatic promises, and didn't storm into meetings demanding justice. Honestly, that silence. It felt suspicious in hindsight. Because while everyone watched Elias unravel, Mason was paying attention to every document, every executive name, every decision, and every person responsible. Nobody realized something dangerous had just started growing underneath the humiliation, and the worst mistake that bank ever made was assuming this story ended with a farmer losing everything. Chapter 3 started feeling less like a financial dispute and more like the beginning of something personal, because once the 7 days ended, the foreclosure happened with a speed that genuinely felt cruel. The farm was gone before most people even processed what was happening. Legal filings moved fast, equipment was tagged for liquidation, and strangers began surveying land Elias's family had worked for generations like history itself had become inventory. Bro, I genuinely couldn't believe how quickly dignity can disappear when institutions decide urgency suddenly matters. 1 week earlier Elias still walked those fields as their caretaker. Now he stood on the edge of them looking like a guest in his own life. And somehow, what made it worse was the silence from people who used to smile at community fundraisers, shake his hand, and promise they valued relationships. Suddenly nobody had time for phone calls. Elias changed after that. The stubborn optimism disappeared first. Then came isolation. He stopped showing up to gatherings, avoided neighbors, and spent long afternoons sitting in a rented house staring through windows without saying much at all. People whispered about depression without using the word directly. You could almost feel the shame hanging over him, even though deep down everyone knew he'd been cornered. That part hit hard because entitlement from powerful people often creates consequences they never even bother imagining. To executives, it was another foreclosure. To Elias, it felt like losing identity, purpose, and memory all at once. But here's where things quietly started shifting. Mason didn't disappear. He became strangely methodical. Publicly, he stayed calm, almost too calm. Privately, he started digging. Financial reports. Investor updates. Expansion strategies. Executive compensation packages. He noticed something nobody in town cared enough to investigate. The bank looked successful on the surface, but underneath? Cracks were spreading. Aggressive acquisitions had created risk. Leadership pushed flashy growth while quietly taking dangerous positions tied to unstable lending. Mason started attending investor events anonymously, listening instead of speaking. He built connections, asked questions, studied weaknesses, and moved with the kind of patience that honestly makes revenge stories terrifying because you stop wondering if someone's angry and start wondering how long they've been planning. And while everyone assumed the Carter family story ended with humiliation, Mason was preparing for something nobody, not even Elias, could have imagined. Chapter 4 became the moment this story stopped feeling tragic and started feeling unreal, because years passed before anyone understood what Mason Carter had actually been building. On the surface, people thought he had simply become successful somewhere far away. Rumors floated around town that he worked in logistics, then finance, then agricultural technology. Nobody knew for sure because Mason barely talked, barely visited, and never corrected assumptions. Meanwhile, Elias carried the foreclosure like a permanent scar. He aged faster, worked smaller temporary contracts, and quietly avoided conversations about the farm altogether. The man who once carried himself with pride now looked permanently exhausted, and honestly, this part genuinely hurt to imagine because losing land wasn't just losing income, it was losing history. Losing identity. Losing proof that decades of sacrifice meant something. Then came the bank's first real crack. Leadership turnover accelerated. Expansion plans started collapsing under pressure from poor investments and risky lending strategies that looked impressive during growth years but dangerous the second economic pressure arrived. Local headlines talked about restructuring, investor uncertainty, and declining confidence. Most people ignored it because banks always seem untouchable until suddenly they're not. But Mason? He had been waiting. Quietly. Patiently. For years, he studied ownership structures, shareholder vulnerabilities, and debt exposure. He built businesses connected to agricultural logistics and supply chains, scaled them aggressively, sold stakes strategically, and turned himself into someone with influence nobody in his hometown could even comprehend. Bro, hearing this kind of long-game energy honestly blows my mind because it stops feeling emotional and starts feeling surgical. And then came the twist nobody saw coming. A private investment consortium suddenly began acquiring meaningful positions tied to the struggling bank. Quiet moves. Small headlines. Nothing dramatic enough for public panic. Executives dismissed it as restructuring noise. Employees barely noticed. Town residents definitely didn't connect the dots. But behind layers of financial entities and investment groups sat one name, Mason Carter. Not revenge in the loud movie-style sense either, no screaming, no threats, no dramatic declarations. Just cold patience. Piece by piece, influence shifted. Decision-making changed. Board pressure increased. 7-week leadership started disappearing. The same institution that once treated a desperate farmer like paperwork was quietly losing control from the inside. And the moment everything truly snapped into focus happened during a shareholder restructuring announcement that stunned the entire region. Mason finally appeared publicly, not as an angry son begging for justice, but as the controlling owner behind the rescue deal that effectively saved the bank from collapse while placing it under entirely new leadership. Imagine being one of the executives who signed off on Elias Carter's 7-day foreclosure and suddenly realizing the person now sitting above you was the son of the man you discarded. That level of karma almost sounds fictional. But Mason didn't celebrate publicly. He didn't rant. Didn't humiliate anyone in front of cameras. Instead, he quietly requested archived records tied to foreclosure practices, internal approvals, and executive conduct. And suddenly, people who once felt untouchable started looking very, very nervous. Chapter 5 felt strangely quiet after all that tension, and honestly, that silence made everything hit even harder. People expected fireworks. Public humiliation. Headlines about revenge. But Mason Carter moved differently. Instead of tearing the bank apart, he started rebuilding it in ways that made one uncomfortable truth impossible to ignore: the institution had never been broken because of struggling farmers, it had been weakened by arrogance. Internal reviews uncovered rushed foreclosure practices, incentive systems rewarding aggressive collections, and leadership decisions that prioritized short-term optics over long-term trust. Several executives quietly disappeared through resignations, contract exits, and investigations into policy failures. No dramatic speeches. No public takedowns. Just consequences arriving one careful decision at a time. Then came the moment the town couldn't stop talking about. Mason purchased back the Carter land, not for profit, not for development, but simply because he could. And instead of handing Elias a symbolic gesture wrapped in cameras and attention, he returned it privately. The paperwork reportedly arrived without celebration, without performance, without conditions. Just ownership restored. Elias, who had spent years carrying humiliation like extra weight on his shoulders, walked the property again in stunned silence. Neighbors said something changed in him afterward. The heaviness lifted. He stood straighter. Smiled more. Started planting again, slowly. And maybe the wildest part. Mason reportedly pushed for hardship protections inside the bank itself, creating review systems so struggling families wouldn't be rushed through the kind of 7-day disaster that destroyed his father's life. That twist genuinely caught me off guard because revenge stories usually end with destruction, but this one quietly turned into accountability. Chapter 6 honestly left me sitting there thinking about how terrifying patience can be when it's attached to purpose. Because this story was never really about money, land, or even the bank itself, it was about what happens when people in power mistake silence for weakness. Elias Carter lost almost everything in 7 days, while the people responsible probably assumed life would simply move on and nobody would remember. But Mason remembered. Quietly. Patiently. And instead of exploding emotionally, he played the longest game imaginable until consequences arrived naturally. Bro, that part genuinely stayed in my head because that's exactly how real life sometimes works. People underestimate the quiet ones, dismiss long memories, and forget that humiliation has a strange way of creating determination. And somehow, the craziest twist wasn't that Mason bought the bank, it was that after everything, he chose accountability over destruction. That part? Honestly unbelievable. If this story had you hooked, drop a comment with what you would have done in Mason's position, and subscribe for more unbelievable comeback stories, betrayal, karma, and wild real-life style narrations that feel too insane to be true.